So the last segment, folks, we detailed why I think, and I think I can speak for Russell, that this Israel-Iran truce is tenuous at best, which is why it is especially disgraceful that the War Powers resolution that Tim Kaine raised in the Senate has failed. Senate blocks War Powers resolution to limit Trump's ability to strike Iran again. The Senate on Friday blocked a Democratic resolution that would have forced President Trump to go to Congress for approval of further military action against Iran, dealing a blow to efforts to rein in his war powers. The 53 to 47 vote against bringing up the resolution, mostly along party lines, came nearly a week after the president unilaterally ordered strikes against 3 Iranian nuclear facilities without consulting the House and Senate. It also followed a searing debate on the Senate floor over the role of Congress in authorizing the use of military force. So it was a strict party line vote with one exception on each side. I bet you can guess who the lone Republican yes vote was and who the lone Democratic no vote was. Not too hard to figure out if you're paying attention. Rand Paul voted yes, and John Fetterman voted no. So that was pretty obvious that those were going to be the dissenters. It was a question, would there be any more? And you got your answer. No. Strict party line vote except for those 2 men. Yes, exactly.
That was Fetterman on the floor of the House.
Yes, that was his
voicing his opposition to the bill.
Yeah, exactly.
He hasn't missed a step from that stroke.
Has not missed a step. That's right. Here is the real life John Fetterman talking about Tim Kaine's War Powers resolution, explaining in very eloquent terms, of course, why he is going to vote no.
Which will come up tomorrow night. You can vote now.
Well, I'll say this. I love that man, and he's coming in from a very principled
I love that man. I love Tim Kaine. I'm saying, I love that man.
He's coming in from a very principled side, but I'm going to vote no on that, simply because I would never want to restrict any future president, Republican or Democrat, to do this kind of a military kind of exercise.
Why would you want to do that?
Yeah, why would you want to do that? Like, the whole point of the vote is to set a precedent that no president can just unilaterally attack.
Yeah.
That's the whole point of the Constitution.
Yeah.
That's
why would you want to
Congress...
exercise your powers as a congressperson, right, as a senator? Yeah,
like it's the dumbest reason you could possibly think of. Well, I just don't want to set a precedent that the Constitution must be followed. I think that's a dangerous precedent to set. That, hey, if Donald Trump doesn't get to just bomb countries on a whim, that means no president gets to bomb countries on a whim. Yeah, that's the whole point.
Once you start going down that road, we might start having to be responsive to our voters.
Exactly. Yeah. Like, that's the whole point
of
why Congress declares war. That's why Congress has the power to declare war. For exactly what you're saying. Except you're saying this is why you're going to vote no.
Any future president, Republican or Democrat, to do this kind of a military kind of exercise that was very successful. This is it.
Wow. Every time I see this guy, I think Dr. Oz lost to this guy. There's a guy who ran against this guy and lost. Could you imagine that? Could you imagine running against him and losing?
And the guy lost on one word. Crudité.
Crudité. That's right.
Crudité cost him the race.
That cost him everything. The measure, sponsored by Senator Tim Kaine, Democrat of Virginia, invoked the War Powers Act, a 1973 law aimed at limiting a president's power to enter an armed conflict without the consent of Congress. It would have required the White House to notify lawmakers and seek the approval of both the House and Senate before U.S. forces could take further military action against Iran. Earlier this week, Mr. Kaine said if the Senate voted to take up his resolution, he would modify it to include language that affirmed the president's authority to act in self-defense. He clarified that it did not limit U.S. support for Israel or any defensive measures it might take against Iran or its proxies. That was in part an effort to unite Democrats around the measure, even though the party is deeply divided over supporting Israel. So he turned it into a bullshit resolution, and it still failed. Still, the resolution had little chance of success in Republican-led Congress that has split bitterly along partisan lines over the strikes. with most GOP lawmakers, even anti-interventionists on the far right, supporting Mr. Trump's actions, and many Democrats outraged about them. War is too big an issue to leave to the moods and whims and the daily vibes of any one person, Mr. Kaine said ahead of the vote. And here is what is very depressing about this. So now that we don't have World War III here, more Americans oppose the U.S. strikes on Iran as MAGA supporters line up with Trump. So it's still true, thankfully, that most Americans oppose those strikes, but MAGA pretty much fell in line. Do you support or oppose the United States bombing nuclear sites in Iran? Support 38% strong, 26 somewhat at 12, unsure 18%, and then 45 opposed, with the strongly opposed being the largest section there at 34 points. So now, if you poll Republicans, do you support or oppose the United States bombing nuclear sites in Iran? More of a supporter of the MAGA movement, 70% of MAGA Republicans say that they strongly support the U.S. airstrikes, which is weird because only 49% of more traditional Republicans, if you want to call them that. I mean, Donald Trump's been leader of the party for 10 years, so it's kind of difficult to say which is which. But 49% of non-MAGA Republicans strongly support the strikes. And if you add somewhat support, that adds 14%. So that means the MAGA Republicans are 84% behind these strikes now, which is more than the non-MAGA Republicans, which is very strange because we always thought that the non-MAGA Republicans were the Nikki Haley Republicans, were the George Bush Republicans, were the John McCain, were the neocons, right? The neocons were supposed to love this, and the MAGA people were supposed to be against this. Not the case now. Case now.
Okay, so my theory of the case here would be, at this point already, this administration has been so awful that only the cultists are describing themselves as MAGA, at this point. And they don't actually have an ideology other than man love for Trump. If Trump does it, they're going to like it. It doesn't matter what it is at this point. We've seen many former MAGA people in our comments saying that's it. As soon as he bombed Iran, we had a lot of them saying, yeah, I'm done with him. I'll never vote for anybody again. So the people who are still like, yeah, I'm MAGA, sure. Wouldn't matter what he did.
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, you could be right about that. That maybe what explains this is that MAGA now has become truly a cult, because anyone who was not so cultish as to blindly support these U.S. airstrikes no longer identifies that way. That is possible. That is certainly possible. If Iran's nuclear program remains intact after U.S. airstrikes, do you believe the United States should continue military operations to prevent Iran from developing a nuclear weapon? This is where the polling gets pretty depressing. Only 41% says no. The United States should not take any further military action. A combined 60% say yes in some capacity. 34 say yes, but only continue with airstrikes. And 26 say yes, the U.S. should consider all options, including the use of ground forces. Oy vey. See, this is what you're up against, folks. This is what we warned you about. Do you support or oppose the United States bombing nuclear sites in Iran? Among Democrats, more a supporter of the progressive movement. 75% say no, the United States should not take any further military action. And 54% of the traditional Democrats, the more moderate Democrats, say no, which is a fairly low number in itself. But now what you're seeing here is you're starting to see a similar dynamic set in as was the case during the Bush years, where just like the Democrats by default are nominally against this, the elected officials, of course, being extremely weak, extremely mealy-mouthed. Chuck Schumer chiding Trump for making a side deal, whatever the hell he was talking about that. No side deals. And then you got Hakeem Jeffries, saying, look, our commitment to Israel has to remain ironclad. Iran is an enemy of the United States, blah, 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 but still voting for this war powers bill, again, it's starting to look a lot like 2003. Way too much. Way too much. And just in case you thought that was an outlier, it is not. CBS News poll, do you approve or disapprove of U.S. strikes on Iran's nuclear facilities? Republicans plus 70, 85% of Republicans approve of the airstrikes. 94% of avowed MAGA Republicans approve of the airstrikes. And this is partly why. Yeah. This is partly why. Because we're not in World War III, you had these morons come out and take a victory lap. Iran gave President Trump no choice. For a decade, he has been adamant that Iran will never get a nuclear weapon. Iran decided to forgo diplomacy in pursuit of a bomb. This is a surgical strike operated perfectly. President Trump acted with prudence and decisiveness. And now you have Matt Gaetz coming out. President Trump basically wants this to be like the Soleimani strike, one and done. No regime change, war. So, just like the left has sheepdogs for the Democrats, the right has sheepdogs for the GOP. Matt Gaetz came out and he said, look, he called Israel out. He said, hey, look, one way to denuclearize the Middle East would be for you guys to denuclearize yourselves. That's all good. At the end of the day, he's there for Donald Trump, just like at the end of the day, AOC is there for Kamala. She's there for Biden. It all a lot of these commentators in the space, they all line up behind the Democrat in the end. There's the same dynamic going on the right. And I feel I am personally concerned that because this latest salvo, this latest exchange, thankfully, knock on wood, thankfully, did not blow up in the World War III, that a lot of the MAGA people who were sounding the alarms about this, are now lulled into a false sense of, well, I guess Trump really is the peace candidate. I guess he's got this after all. He doesn't got this. He doesn't got this. He's still being led around by a foreign power that is hell-bent on overthrowing the Iranian government. And they have been chirping quite loudly about that since this ceasefire came into being, to the point where Trump had to curse them out on TV because they essentially violated it as soon as they signed it. He had to warn them, hey, let's try to figure out another way. And I do believe that is Trump's goal. If he had it to do his way, he would not start World War III. The rub here is that he is compromised and he is being led around by them. He is answering to Israel. That's obvious. And so it's going to take massive public pressure to prevent this from coming back in a way that does embroil us in a regime change war. I know it's a cliche, but, bookmark this segment because I have a feeling it's going to become an emergency again, I would say by the end of the year. And this polling is not encouraging. It's not encouraging.
Donald, you didn't forget about the Polaroids, did you?
Yeah,
We still
exactly,
have
man.
them. We can release them anytime. No, I sent Keaton earlier. There's what's the name of that reporter?
What's the what's his name? Michael Wolff.
Yeah, he was doing an interview, and he says that he personally saw these photos that were taken of Trump during his relationship with Epstein sometime between 1999 and 2001. We don't know if it's true, but it seems pretty consistent with what we know about Epstein, what we know about Mossad. We know that Trump hung out with him pretty hard. What are the odds they don't have blackmail material? Because Trump is a guy who, if you look at his MO, if you look at the mentality of his whole administration, they're like gangsters. They want you to show submission to them in order to deal with them. That's how they handled Liberation Day, right?
Yeah.
Hey, if you don't do anything, if you don't retaliate, then you're going to get a good deal. If you retaliate, you're in fucking trouble, right? So he deals with Israel uniquely. This one country, is it just the money? He gets money from a lot of people, and then look what he's doing to Elon. Look what
Right,
he's
of course.
doing to Elon.
Yeah, exactly, yeah.
That he's not a guy to really care, especially when he doesn't have to run again. His concern is not for anyone but himself, and for him politically, what does it matter? He doesn't need any of these people again. Why is he this subservient to Israel? You look at the Epstein connection, makes a lot of sense that that's why.
The whole way he has gone about this is very un-Trump-like. From the lifeless way in which he kept repeating, Iran can't have a nuclear weapon.
Right.
And then through the first days of the war, he was basically hiding from the cameras. He didn't want to show his face. He didn't want to have to come out and take questions about this or even make a definitive statement about this. When you combine that with the fact that he is insisting that these nuclear sites are destroyed, that's his way of saying, it's over. It's done with. We did it. They have no nuclear program. Moving on, right? And the third thing is this now repeated insistence that the charges against Bibi get dropped in Israel.
Right.
It's common knowledge in Israel. Bibi keeps these wars going to avoid prosecution. Bill Clinton said that. They say he keeps the wars going so he can stay in power, so he doesn't have to stand trial. So I feel very strongly that the reason Donald Trump is pushing to get the charges dropped is to give Netanyahu an off-ramp. Say, okay, listen, they're not going to throw your ass in jail now, so stop the wars. You can afford to stop it now. When you add those three things together, yeah, it seems like Donald Trump doesn't want war, but he also knows that when push comes to shove, he has to give Israel what they want. That's how he's handling this. That's what it looks like to me. Doesn't look like Donald Trump is leading the charge into war. It looks like Donald Trump is being led around by an entity that owns his ass and is trying to figure out a way to wiggle out of it. That's what it looks like to me.
Please clap.